Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm here in wonderful, beautiful Maryland, Columbia, Maryland, and I'm going to talk about Chapter 4 of the Colonial Crucible in Latin American history. This should be week 5, if I'm calculating correctly, on our course on Latin American civilization, and this is from Chapter 4, which deals with the Colonial Crucible. It's taken from John Chasteen's wonderful book, Born in Blood and Fire. And this is the fall of 2023. So let's take a look at the Colonial Crucible, shall we? And we get into my other view. Here we go. Colonial Crucible, week 5 of LAH 2020 from John Chasteen's Born in Blood and Fire. And here's the timeline for this particular week. We're looking at from 1600 to about the 1790s. That's a big stretch of time to go through in 1 week, but this chapter does a great job of it with John Chasteen's writing. So the mature colonial period in his estimation as a historian begins around 1600, and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was a remarkable person in this time period, was born in 1651, and we'll talk more about her. In 1690s, gold is discovered in the interior of Brazil, and the Bandeirantes, who are the pioneers, I suppose you could say, of Brazilian folklore or history, began to strike out from Sao Paulo and travel to the interior of Minas Gerais to prospect for gold. The Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, which is modern-day Buenos Aires, was created in 1776 because the colonial system was becoming more complex. You had a Viceroyalty of New Spain, located in Mexico City. You had a Viceroyalty in Lima, Peru, which governed all of South America, but it had become unwieldy, so another Viceroyalty was created in Rio de la Plata. Eventually, another one would also be created in Bogota, Santa Fe de Bogota. In 1790s, you have the French Revolution, which changes everything, absolutely everything. So I don't know how much we'll get into the French Revolution, but we're moving towards that, which was the catalyst for independence, basically. And here is a picture of San Luis de Potosí, which was a mountain in Bolivia, a mountain made of silver. And it was honeycombed with mine shafts. It was up around 12,000 feet elevation. So working in this mine was not for the faint of heart. And this was a major source of Spanish wealth during this period. There were also silver mines in Guanajuato, Mexico. The colonization of the Americas was a process more than an outcome. 3 centuries of Iberian control of Latin America was characterized by a cultural and psychological process of adaptation and of the colonized and the colonizers. In other words, both the Europeans and the indigenous people, of course, were obligated to adapt to one another in order to live together. As Latin American societies grew up around the hard edges of domination, like roots of a tree, gradually embracing the rock at its base, adaptation made colonization endurable, but also embedded in it people's habits. I might add traumas as well. Indigenous African and European people intermingled, fought, and they slept together. Over hundreds of years, most Latin Americans began to sincerely accept Catholicism and the rule of a Spanish or Portuguese king as legitimate. A colonial economy, both the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns had limited resources for colonization. Neither had large military forces in the American colonies, so how did they do it? How did they hold together these empires without depending on military force? The Iberian colonizers and their American-born descendants were a small minority even in the core areas. So John Chasteen asked the question that I just did: how did they maintain control over so much of the hemisphere for 3 centuries? A very impressive feat of colonialism. The colonial economy depended on gold, the first precious metal to attract the attentions of Europeans, but eventually silver was the most common resource, precious metal that was discovered. And I just showed you the picture of the Potosi mountain, which was a mountain in upper Peru, which is today in Bolivia, of basically solid silver. And that financed a lot of the Spanish wars in Europe against revolting Protestants. The silver mines of Zacatecas in Mexico and Potosi in Peru were opened in the 1540s. Zacatecas, an area without sedentary inhabitants, attracted indigenous migrants. Migrants also became miners in Potosi. On a windswept mountain plateau at 12,000 feet were Spanish smelting techniques using a bellows did not work, and indigenous ones, which channeled the Andean wind, had to be adopted instead. So here's a case where the Europeans are adapting to the indigenous people and using some of their techniques. Potosi became the most populous city in America in the 1600s despite the high altitude. But no food could be grown there. So you have the largest city in America. No food could be grown there. It all had to be backpacked up on mule trains from lower elevations. The need for supplies created a secondary economy around the mines. Mining zones created a space for the mingling of different indigenous and European peoples. Economic priorities in the Spanish crown shaped the political organization. So they took a royal fifth, which is a 20% tax on all mining. It was a major source of revenue for the Spanish throne. Colonial governments called viceroyalties were organized to secure the tax. So here are the viceroyalties. I already mentioned this earlier. New Spain had a viceroyalty located in modern-day Mexico City. In Peru, in Lima, Peru, you had a viceroyalty that ruled over most of South America. In New Granada, modern Colombia, there was another viceroyalty created in 1717 to control gold mining in Colombia. And in Rio de la Plata, which is modern-day Buenos Aires, modern Argentina, created in 1776, a famous date from our own United States history. And it was created to stop the flow of untaxed silver down the river from Potosi. And so this brings us to sugar. Brazil did not have large quantities of silver, and there were gold deposits that were discovered in Minas Gerais, but not until 1690. So the main source of economic wealth for Brazil was sugar, white gold, I guess you might say. The rich soil made the northeast Brazil, Pernambuco, and the Bay of All Saints the focus of colonial activity. Let me go to my map here. This shows this area up here. I don't know if you can see this along the coast of northeastern coast of Brazil is the sugar area. And in Sao Paulo, that was where the most of the pioneers set out, known in Portuguese as the Bandeirantes, exploring into the interior of Brazil. The Amazonian Northwest remained a vast equatorial rainforest. So that would be up in this area. Inhabited chiefly by semi-sedentary indigenous tribes. Half the continent with a mere handful of tiny Portuguese towns and a sprinkling of Jesuit missions along the banks of its major highways. When I say major highways, I meant to say river highways. The backlands behind the sugar coast, and that's this area right behind this golden coast here, was called the Sertão, and it stayed dirt poor cattle country. So Brazil lagged a little bit behind. This is a closer view of Brazil, and up here is the sugar producing area in blue. The Sertão, or the dry bushlands, were behind it. We'll talk more about that later. And then way down here you have Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. There was cattle and dairy areas in the southern part of Brazil because that's more moderate, less tropical. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And then up here you have the Amazon rainforest, and all of this just sparsely populated. Overall, colonial Brazil could not compete with colonial Spanish America. Sugar was never as precious as silver. Only slowly did Brazil become the principal focus of the Portuguese seaborne empire, which was mostly located along the coast of Africa and in India, with its rich African and Asian outposts. So the Brazilian colony remained in all ways less poor, less populous, with only a tenth of the people of Spanish America, and more loosely governed. For example, there were a dozen universities in Spanish America that, after barely a century of colonization, but none was ever established in colonial Brazil. And here's a picture of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. You're going to be watching a movie about her. But let me come back to my other view here first. So at this point, John Chasteen introduces an important concept called hegemony. Hegemony, hegemony. Both the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns had limited resources for colonization. Neither had a large military forces in the American colonies. Iberian colonizers and American-born descendants, who were known as Creoles, were a small minority even in the core areas. So how did they maintain control over so much of the hemisphere for 3 centuries? And the answer is hegemony. So what is hegemony? Hegemony is a kind of domination that implies a measure of consent by those at the bottom. In other words, this is not military force with their boots on the necks of the colonized, but this is a narrative that the colonized has to buy into, along with the colonizers, that makes the system legitimate. And it squashes dissent. It causes people to go along with it and not question. Hegemony contrasts with control by violent force. It is a steady preponderance rather than an iron rule. Though it may seem soft, this form of political power is resilient and does devastating damage to people at the bottom. When they accept the principle to know their place, of their own inferiority, they participate in their own subjugation, and they choose not to question it. It doesn't even occur to them. So the example that the John Chasteen uses here is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I just showed you a picture of her. Let me go back and show it again. This is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and one of the most brilliant and significant figures of the 17th century in Mexico. She had been reading since the age of 3, and she learned Latin just for fun. I wished I had that kind of amazing capacity for language. She stumped a jury of over 40 university professors at the age of 17. Juana became known throughout Mexico for her poetry. Like other women of her class, she had 2 alternatives: get married and devote her energies to her husband and children and running a household, or become a nun. She chose the convent life. She became a nun. Act more like a woman. Juana received instructions from the colonial authorities to act more like a woman. That's gendered for you there. Her scientific interests, they said, and her other interests, too, except for the religious devotion, were unnatural in a woman. She consented and sold her library, her instruments, and everything, that is, scientific instruments, and devoted herself to atonement for the sin of curiosity. She was a broken woman. She confessed to being the worst of all women, I the worst of all. In the movie that you will watch, Yo la peor de todos, is a quote from what she said about herself. And it's on YouTube, Yo la peor de todos, with subtitles in English. And you will be asked to watch that film with the subtitles and have a forum discussion on that. And it's an interesting case study in hegemony. She believed that she should act more like a woman, and she went along with the system rather than buck the system. Religion is another interesting area of this. I teach a course this fall. I'm teaching it right now, called Introduction to Religion in Latin America, and we go into a lot of this. Religion in Latin America. So if you're interested, let me know. It's an online course. I'll give you more information. Religion offers one of the clearest examples of cultural hegemony. When enslaved Africans and indigenous people accepted the Europeans' true religion, they accepted their own status as newcomers to the faith. In other words, once you accept the religious worldview of your colonizers, you pretty much buy into their whole system. The monarchs of Spain and Portugal reigned by divine right, according to this belief system. They enjoyed a royal patronage of rights, allowing them to appoint or dismiss priests and bishops as if they were crown employees. The royal government decided where churches should be built and collected the tithe, which was an ecclesiastical tax of 10%. Imagine if the federal government would take 10% of your income to support churches. That's basically what this is. To sin against Catholic teaching was in many cases a criminal offense. Thank God we live in a system with religious freedom, freedom of conscience. So this enduring Iberian hegemony lasted for 3 centuries. The fathers of the church never used physical force against Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. They didn't have to. They embodied religious authority, and she was a religious woman. Revolt or disobedience was literally unthinkable to her. Similarly, the conquered indigenous people of Latin America, the enslaved Africans as well, gradually accepted the basic premises of colonial life and the principles of Iberian authority. Otherwise, Spain and Portugal could never have ruled over the vast expanse of America. And when we say America here, we're talking about South America, the Caribbean, and Central America, and a good maybe half of North America before the U.S. and Mexican War. They could not have ruled over that vast expanse of half of the hemisphere without occupying armies. So what made that possible was a particular worldview and a justification called hegemony. There was also educational hegemony. All educational institutions in this time period were religious. If knowledge is power, and it is, the church monopolized that power. The Inquisition kept a list of banned books that people were not allowed to read. The church even controlled the time. The tolling of bells set the rhythm of the day. Successive Sundays were marked the 7-day week, which was new to the indigenous. The Catholic calendar of observances and holidays marked the year. The milestone of individual lives, from baptism to marriage to death, were validated by church sacraments and registered in church records. Place names, too, were frequently religious. I think I have another picture coming up here. Let's see. So here is a painting of armed angels to illustrate the close relationship between religion and authority in the 18th century Andes. You notice the wings on the back of this angel, and he's got a gun. Okay, moving right along. Armed angels. Shaking my head here. Okay, patriarchy was another hegemonic force, omnipresent and inescapable. The general principle is that fathers rule, that fathers have the final word in their homes. We still have that around. I hope some of my say that. The Spanish and Portuguese were the most rigidly patriarchal than many other American or African societies. So the hegemony of fathers must have been seen as a legacy of colonialism. The patriarchy structured all the colonial institutions, including the exclusively male hierarchy of the church, right up to the Holy Father in Rome, and down to the local priest. Iberian law was based on patriarchal principles. Husbands had legal control over their wives, as well as over their children. This is why Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz only had two options, either be a housewife or to be a nun, and she chose a nun over a housewife. There's another film that I highly recommend. I don't recall if we're going to be watching it in this course, but it's about a young woman who lived in Argentina in the 1830s under the dictatorship of Juan Manuel de Rosas. And it clearly illustrates this whole thing of patriarchy and the honor-based system. Another term that we're going to learn in this chapter is transculturation. Not acculturation, but transculturation. This was coined by an influential Cuban anthropologist named Fernando Ortiz back in the 1930s. He began to realize acculturation is the idea that there's a one-way adaptation. When I lived in Colombia for 2 years as an exchange student, I began the process of acculturation, of learning to think more like a Colombian, to speak more Spanish. Transculturation is a different idea. It's a two-way acculturation. It's a two-way street. And the idea of transculturation is that the inculturation goes both ways. If a large enough number of Yoruba people, men and women, are kidnapped and taken forcibly to Cuba, where they must learn Spanish, and they must learn Spanish music, and they must do forced labor. If there is enough of them, then their Spanish owners or Cuban owners began to get influenced in return and began to learn some African dishes in cooking, or may begin to worship in Santeria, which is a combination. Ortiz's point was that the dominated cultures of the Africans and the indigenous peoples were not wiped away in Latin America to be entirely replaced by European cultures. Instead, there was a blend between these, and it became something new, not resulted from the give and take. Something new resulted from the give and take, something not European, not indigenous, not African, but rather something distinctively Cuban in the case of Cuba, or in Brazil, distinctively Brazilian. A kind of a blend or acculturation of both. In the United States, we sometimes talk about the melting pot. Like hegemony, transculturation has become a key concept in Latin American studies. Historians now believe that transculturation lies at the origin of Latin America's national cultures. So Latin American countries are not exclusively European, they're not exclusively African, they're not exclusively indigenous. They're a new blend that results from this process called transculturation. So transculturation and hegemony are two sides of the same coin, one positive, the other negative. Cuba's shared musical and dance culture, famously a harmonious marriage of the Spanish guitar and the African drum. Thank God for salsa. I took several years of lessons. That's transculturation in action. The people on the top in Latin America's colonial crucible were always able to remain on top, but they were influenced by the people below. The people below contributed subtle elements of style, rhythm, texture, and mood. And you will see this in Brazil with samba. You'll see it in Argentina with tango. You'll see it in the Dominican Republic with merengue. Over and over, this process happened in these different countries. This process called transculturation. There was also a degree of syncretism. And we can go back to our picture here. Syncretism means a blending of different religious beliefs. The most famous example being the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico City. There's a whole story of a vision or apparition that appeared to Juan Diaz, or Juan Diego, or Juan Diaz, I don't recall now, which announced herself as the Virgin of Guadalupe. She was dark-skinned, and a chapel was built to the Virgin of Guadalupe immediately over the shrine to the Aztec goddess Tonitzan. And so there's a process of, obvious process of syncretism here, which happened. Something similar happened in Cuba with Santeria, which is a blend of folk Catholicism and Yoruban religion. Okay, let's talk a little bit about urban hegemony. The institutions of colonial governance existed in cities. All administrative officials, bishops, judges, notaries, merchants, and moneylenders, the people whose commands, reports, and dealings with one another connected cities to Europe, were urban-based. Cities were organized in great public spectacles that dramatized imperial power. Solemn processions for Holy Week, ceremonial welcomes for new viceroys, boisterous celebrations to commemorate royal marriages, immense churches and convents. All this was part of the urban hegemony, according to John Chasteen. But this contrast with rural patterns outside of the cities. Europeans were few, and colonial institutions were rare. So country Creoles or Europeans, white people living in the rural areas, took on more native and African culture, food dishes, music, language patterns, and so you see a different process in the rural areas. And so this was a blessing and a curse. For Latin America's subjugated majorities, transculturation was a blessing and a curse. Because in some ways it gave them some room to maneuver, but at the same time it caused them to buy into the system and cooperate with it. This is a painting from Guaman Poma de Ayala, illustrating Spanish exploitation of the indigenous people. Okay, so going back to my other view. So, there's a very different pattern at the fringes of Spanish colonial culture as well as Brazilian. At the fringes, you had more of this, you had semi-sedentary peoples, you had less Spaniards, less Portuguese. It was conquest and slavery that created the central conflict of Latin American history. So that's where the history must begin. And I think John Chasteen does an amazing job of telling a story of 20 different nations with all kinds of different blends of ethnic diversity and culture and historical experience. But people, where there were few people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, became more important. People of mixed race got a little more respect in fringe areas. Even slaves received better treatment in fringe areas because of their replacement price was harder to afford. Paraguay, Rio de la Plata, southern Chile, northern Mexico, which is now the southeast of the U.S. No, it should be southwest of the USA, and Cuba were fringe areas. And we had the picture here of the Araucanos. The Araucan people of southern Chile resisted Spanish encroachment for several centuries. They were also called the Mapuches. They were fierce and warlike, and they fought off the Spanish until late in the 19th century, kind of like some of the Plains Indians in the United States experience. There were also cattle, buckaroos, and cowboys. Have you ever heard the term buckaroo? A buckaroo was a unfortunate English pronunciation of vaquero. Vaqueros were Mexican cowboys, who, of course, the Mexican cowboys or vaqueros were in Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, a long time before white Anglo cowboys arrived, and the white Anglo cowboys learned how to be a cowboy from the vaqueros, and they pronounced it buckaroo. I mispronounced it. In Rio de la Plata, there were gauchos. In Chile, there was guasos. In Mexico, it was vaqueros, buckaroos. And these were the people who were living on the fringes. There's the Araucanos. Okay, let me see if I can do this. I got too much technology. Here's a picture of a buckaroo, a Mexican vaquero. This thing will not move, will it? Okay, guys, bear with me. It will not move. Okay, forget it. So there's a vaquero. And they're long. Nope, it's not going to let me. Exit drawing. Now try it. There we go. Quilombo. The most famous quilombo is in Palmares in Brazil. It survived for 90 years, separate from Brazilian society. Escaped Africans or African slaves or even African Creole slaves who had been born in Brazil would run off and escape and form these quilombos. And the most famous being Palmares, which was almost an independent society, a kingdom, and was led by a heroic warrior king named Zumbi. And we've already talked about the colonial administrative positions. The Kingdom of Guatemala, the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada up in Colombia, and the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata down in Argentina. And this is a picture of racial mixing. So the people at the very bottom of the racial system were the Africans or indigenous. I've got two different charts. One puts the indigenous at the very bottom. The other one puts the Africans at the very bottom. So it's probably a coin toss. And above them are Zombos, people of mixed indigenous and African ancestries. And then you had mulattoes, people of mixed European and African. Mestizos were people of mixed European and indigenous, which is in some countries like Mexico or Mala, Bolivia, there's a huge number of mestizos. They're the majority of the population. Criollos were white people born in the Americas. Not always. You also can, the term is used to describe Africans who were born in Cuba, were criollos. So basically, but in this context, it's white people near the top of the social hierarchy. And then Spaniards or Portuguese were at the very top. And here's a picture of a family. This is kind of a famous painting, trying to whiten themselves in each generation. And here is a picture of a famous woman in Brazil, Chica da Silva. I recommend the book if you can find it. It's a true story about her life. She was a mulata with an African mother, Portuguese father. She became the mistress of a wealthy royal diamond contractor, Portuguese, who provided her with honor and signs of upper class. She looked down on Europeans, challenging the caste system. That was Chica da Silva. And so this concludes our discussion on the Colonial Crucible. There are some words that you need to know. You need to know patriarchy, transculturation, banderantes. You need to read about the Bourbon and Pombaline reforms, the caste system, hegemony, and the Royal Fifth, and a few other things there. So at the end of this, there's some study questions for you to consider. How were Spanish American Brazil organized in economic terms? How can you compare silver with sugar? How did they manage to keep control over the territories for 3 centuries? what does hegemony mean? What does transculturation mean? Why is it important? So we'll see you in class, and thank you for your attention. Good to be with you again.